I think a better way of understanding bias is to see it as an unacknowledged perspective.
Hello, and welcome to The Perception Bias. I'm your host, Sophie Scott-Brown. We think there is a correct way of seeing the world, and we look to eradicate any bias that might vitiate this true perception of the world. But is this an error? Psychologists argue that perceptual biases are at the heart of our understanding of the world. Moreover, philosophers going back to Kant have argued that without the imposition of human concepts on sensation, there would be no perception and no consciousness. Should we reject the desire to overcome bias and see the world truly, and instead see our perception of the world as one particular outcome of an extended process of trial and error? Should we see our bias essential to what makes us unique as an individual, or is it essential that we seek to uncover our biases to see the world as it really is? Now, joining me to tackle this fascinating topic, we have three amazing speakers for you tonight. Firstly, we have Daniel Kahneman, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist and psychologist, known for his groundbreaking work in behavioral economics. He is the author of several international best-selling books, including Thinking, Fast and Slow, and Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment. Ellen Langer is a professor of psychology at Harvard University and the author of The Mindful Body. Among other honors, she is the recipient of 3 Distinguished Scientist Awards, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the Liberty Science Genius Award. She is widely known as the mother of mindfulness. And finally, Hilary Lawson, who is a philosopher and long-standing critic of realism, best known for his theory of closure. He is the editorial director of the Institute of Art and Ideas. Well, welcome to all of our speakers, and I'm sure we're in for a fantastic discussion. We're going to start off as normal. Each of the speakers are going to have 3 minutes to give you their thoughts on today's pitch, which is, can we overcome bias and see the world as it is, or is bias essential to being human? And I'm going to start off by turning to Daniel Kahneman. Daniel, what do you think? Is bias essential to being human?
Well, I would think so, yes. Let me start by introducing a notion of individual differences or differences between individuals in their biases. And that's the work I've been doing in recent years. And the best way I can introduce it is by the example of a study of 208 federal judges in the United States who were presented 16 vignettes of crimes indicating what the crime was and various characteristics of the defendant. And they were asked to set a sentence to the individual. And the results are rather shocking, because the results are there are enormous differences between judges. To put that in context, if you take a crime for which the average sentence is 7 years, and you take 2 judges at random, what you would expect to find as a difference between their sentences is almost 4 years. This is the lottery that the defendant faces. What judge and in what mood will the defendant meet? And there are 2 types of noise here. One of them is very obvious. Some judges are more lenient, others are more severe. That's clear. The much more interesting one is that judges differ in their tastes. They differ in the crimes that they view as more important than others. Some are made very angry by fraud, and others are mostly indignant about violence. Some are particularly upset by crimes against old people. Others are quite lenient when the criminal is young. And each individual judge is characterized by a very complex pattern of tastes that differ from judge to judge. And the moral of this is, of course, these are different biases, But the biases are really very different for different individuals. And the point that this makes, I think, is that we different individuals, we live in different worlds. We see the world very differently from other people, much more differently than we think. And the reason is simple. Every one of us is convinced that I see the world the way I do because that's the way it is. And so I expect other people to see the world as I do because that's the way it is. But in fact, they do not see the world as I do. There are large differences, and there are large differences that everybody finds surprising because everyone really overestimates the extent to which other people live in the same world as he or she does.
Daniel, thank you very much for getting us off to a fantastic start. Ellen, I'm going to come to you now with the same question. Can we overcome bias and see the world as this, or is bias essential to being human?
I think the term bias suggests there's a correct way of viewing the world, independent of perspective, context, and time. And if that's the case, then whose perspective is the one that should be trusted? You know, if you take a simple example, if you see me as gullible, but I see myself as trusting, which one of us is biased? If I see you as inconsistent, you see yourself as flexible, which one of us is biased? Is it better to see the world, the glass as half empty or half full? So I think a better way of understanding bias is to see it as an unacknowledged perspective. Now, should we get rid of all these different perspectives? To me, I would shudder if that were the case, unless there were some way of knowing which across all time and perspective was the correct perspective we should take. And I think that essentially, consider a very simple example. One of the things we all know to be true, teacher asks student, how much is 1 and 1? And the student, little Ellen, says 1. Now, in the world that we've just described, that little Ellen is wrong. And depending on how nice the teacher is, we would either disparage her, ignore her, or what have you. But in the world that I would prefer to live in, the teacher would say, little Ellen, how did you come up with that answer? And she would then say, well, if you add 1 wad of chewing gum to 1 wad of chewing gum, 1 plus 1 is 1. And when the other students hear that, maybe somebody else realizes 1 pile of laundry plus 1 pile of laundry is 1. And somebody else, 1 cloud plus 1 cloud equals 1. And then we come to the understanding that perhaps in the real world, 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2, as or more often as it does. All right, so the main thing is when we're talking about perspective, truth, from where do we get this truth? And if somebody is going to say we get it from science, I shudder at that thought as well, because science only gives us probabilities, not absolutes. If we were to do the exact same study, the science tells us that we're likely to get this result, not that we will get this result. And that becomes part of our understanding of the world. So I was taught, for instance, horses don't eat meat. Okay, I don't know what science produced that, but let's just assume they had many horses and they gave horses grass or meat, and all the horses that were there ate the grass. I'm at this horse event, and this man asked me, would I watch his horse because he wanted to go get his horse a hot dog? Well, I'm laughing to myself because I think a belief in a single reality leads to a certain kind of arrogance. And I loved it because he came back with the hot dog and the horse ate it. And that's when I realized everything I thought I knew could be wrong. I think that if we were to homogenize things rather than increase diversity and variability, we would limit innovation, for one thing. And I think that for me, I want to go back to what is the larger question we're asking. If the question is how to create a more equitable and just world where happiness is the rule rather than the exception, then I think rather than deal with biases, which again, for me, are just perspectives, we'd be best to promote an evolution in consciousness, teach people around the world to be more mindful. And in doing so, they would respect multiple perspectives.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you, Ellen. Hilary, I'm going to turn to you now again with the same provocation, please.
So I have points very much in common with both Ellen and Daniel, and I've got a proposal about how we might think about the circumstance that they've described. So it seems to me we can refer to bias in a number of different ways, perhaps as a deliberate attempt to manipulate or present information to achieve a given outcome, or also as an unconscious prejudice that influences our decision, introduces errors without our being aware of it. But there's a deeper sense in which we're biased, I think the one to which Ellen was referring, which is our overall perspective on the world. We all carry a conceptual frame which we use to understand things, in which we couch it, as it were. And it seems to me that surely it is the case that we want to overcome the first of these two biases, but we can't overcome the third, the one which is about the overall perspective. And that's why it seems to me bias is sometimes used as a rhetorical claim to challenge views we disagree with. So, I mean, just think of Western governments and their description of, say, Russian or Chinese policy. They're inclined to say that it's biased. But of course, those governments themselves are inclined to say that Western governments are biased. And really, they're just pointing to a different conceptual frame that they're using to apply to the circumstance. Now, as a result of that, I'm philosophically a non-realist. That is, I don't think that our theories and language are capable of describing an ultimate reality. I don't think that's what they do. I think instead they're ways of holding the world which enables us to intervene. They provide us with frameworks to intervene. You can think of them, I guess, as sort of metaphors or models. I use the language of forms of closure. They're ways of closing the world that enable us to hold the world as something in particular. And then we intervene on the basis of that to get outcomes. And we close the world differently and with different outcomes. Now, sometimes in holding this view, I'm misunderstood to be saying that, well, we can make up anything we want, you know, that our ideas, our theories are just free floating. They've got nothing to do with reality. Of course, I'm arguing no such thing. There's plenty of constraint when we put forward a given conceptual frame. That comes from the way that we're using the words in other contexts, the fact that we want to apply it in other circumstances, the fact that we want it to be successful. We want it to actually result in outcomes that we desire. So there's plenty of constraint, but that constraint doesn't somehow lead us to the truth. It enables us to refine our models and our closures, as I would call them, but it doesn't lead us to a true version of the world, which we can just impose, as it were, on everyone. So, in answer, therefore, to the overall question that you posed, Sophie, we should and can seek to overcome deliberate or unconscious bias, but we can't somehow escape our particular historical, cultural, human perspective to reach a God's eye view of the world. And to imagine that we can is indeed, as Ellen was saying, dangerous. Because it leads to a notion that we might be certain about our view, and it increases the conflict with others, which surely in the divisive world we operate in is not to be valued.
Hilary, thank you. So there's some really interesting ideas already coming through here. I'm just going
to continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.